Chapter 3. Christianity on Trial. I could not end my inquiry by investigating only Christianity's strongest points. No matter how strong those points might have been, it remained possible that Christianity had some fatal flaw, some logical fallacy as difficult to explain as the origin of the universe apart from God, or the early Christian martyrs apart from the resurrection. In fact, an attack on Christianity had to be precisely that strong to be successful, strong enough that it would be reasonable for me to go back and accept the flimsy rationales offered by Christianity's opponents in the prior two chapters. At any rate, my final step would be to place Christianity on trial and see if it could withstand the scrutiny. It certainly wasn't difficult to find critics, but only some of their criticisms struck me as strong enough to merit any real investigation or reflection. Foremost for me was what is called the problem of evil, which seeks to undercut the Christian view of God's nature. Even more difficult for me were the problems posed by God's harshness described in the Bible. After that, I will address a few arguments that I never found persuasive, but have heard often enough to think they're worth mentioning. One, the countless other religions making it highly improbable that Christianity is the correct one. Two, the impossibility of miracles. Three, the atrocities committed by Christians throughout history. And four, the biblical claims that have been disproven by science. The problem of evil. The problem of evil has been often presented as a logical death blow to Christianity, which is why I was immediately drawn to it. The argument begins by noting that Christians view God as both omnibenevolent and omnipotent, perfectly good and all-powerful. The problem is, our world brims with evil. The innocent suffer, the wicked prosper, billions are afflicted with starvation, illness, and injustice. I can even flip on BBC's seemingly innocent documentary, Planet Earth, and witness gut-wrenching brutality within the animal kingdom. So, the argument goes, Christianity fails since it cannot be true that 1. God is perfectly good, 2. God is all-powerful, and 3. Evil exists. Something must give. Either God is good but not powerful enough to eradicate evil, or God is powerful but not good enough to eradicate evil. The Christian view of God is thus straightforwardly defeated. I quickly learned that the problem of evil is no longer widely used in the philosophical community to argue that the Christian God's existence is logically impossible. That aim was simply too ambitious, since refuting it merely required producing some logically plausible reason for why the existence of evil might be necessary to accomplish a weightier good. Alvin Plantinga's essay, Free Will Defense, was perhaps the most decisive defeat of Christianity's opponents on that philosophical front. But I still had to evaluate what is sometimes called the evidentiary problem of evil, which argues that although it is technically possible within the confines of logic for evil to exist in a world governed by an all-powerful and perfectly good God, God's existence remains unlikely in light of the horrid evils at work in the world we do in fact live in. Witness chattel slavery or childhood leukemia. The Christian must be able to produce some reason God would have allowed such terrible things to happen. One early observation that struck me about the problem was that it's a problem we all have to deal with whether we believe in God or not. It was often presented to me as a logical problem for one believing in the Christian God, but it seemed clear to me that evil is a problem everyone recognizes. Here's what I mean. Much in our world isn't as it should be, and everyone can tell, Christian or not. The only difference is that the Christian approaches evil with the belief that God will someday set things right, whereas the atheist approaches evil with, at best, the hope that things will incrementally improve before the universe goes dark. The Christian must explain how God could allow genocide before ultimately making things right, but the atheist must accept that victims of genocide died meaningless deaths and will never receive 1 ounce of justice. A second observation that struck me was that atheists must borrow the term evil from Christians to even use it. The atheist lives in a purely physical world of cause and effect, where it makes no sense to say the world should or shouldn't be some way. In a world caused and governed by mindless processes, there is no sense in saying something should be happening. There is only what is happening. Thus, when an atheist remarks on what should be, he usually means whatever is most painless or pleasurable or life-extending for himself, humanity, or living creatures more generally. A long and pleasant life would be the ideal existence, and evil would be any threat to that. For the Christian, however, evil would be anything outside the will of God, since he is the source not merely of all good things, but of everything. The concept of goodness independent of God is impossible within Christianity. The only way people could ever be drawn to good or repulsed by evil would be if God designed them that way. Goodness could be nothing other than God's personality and preferences, and evil would be not merely what is, but rather a deviation from how things should be. That's why Christians believe evil will ultimately fall, and that all evils from the history of the world will be set right. In their view, the all powerful source of goodness has told them so. A third and final observation, though it is intertwined with the first two, was that the problem of evil was not so much an attack on God's existence as it was an attack on his goodness. After all, the problem of evil has nothing to do with the origin or design of the universe, nor with the resurrection of Jesus, nor does it diminish in any way the likelihood of those events. The problem of evil is meant, at its core, to demonstrate that the God responsible for creating this universe could be called many things, but good is not one of them. These initial three observations did nothing to move the argument one way or another. The first two were just another set of emotional appeals reminding me of the stakes. Evil was either a neutral but uncomfortable state of affairs, or it was truly objectively wrong and would be solved in the end. And as for the third, it left me with this vague dread that I might come to believe in a God I could not trust to be good. As I drilled nearer to the heart of the argument, I came across all sorts of explanations for why a good God might have allowed evil to exist, but two were especially common. One, free will, and two, soul making. Concerning free will, the argument can go a number of ways. At a very general level, the idea is that God wanted to love people who could freely choose to love him back, and the possibility of such mutual love is a weighty enough good that it was worth the evil that would be caused by those who freely rejected him. A common atheist reply to this free will defense is that if God were truly all powerful, he could make creatures that always freely chose to do good. This made no sense to me. A creature cannot have the freedom to choose good or evil, yet be guaranteed to invariably do good. The thought of it reminds me of the self-defeating questions my friends at school used to ask. Would Pinocchio's nose grow if he said, "My nose will grow"? What happens if an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? Is God powerful enough to create a stone so heavy that even he can't lift it? Such questions are mere wordplay, not rooted in anything real. When it comes to God's inability to make free creatures that invariably choose goodness, this is no more threat to God's power than his inability to draw square-shaped circles. Such impossibilities have nothing to do with power and everything to do with logical coherence. Something can be impossible in a natural sense, or impossible because it is an incoherent, meaningless concept. For instance, rising from the dead is impossible by the rules of nature, but not impossible to imagine. Given sufficient power over the natural world, it could be done, but drawing a square-shaped circle is not merely impossible to do, it is impossible even to imagine. It is a meaningless concept. Extraordinary power is attributed to the God of Christianity. The power to walk on water, calm storms, heal the sick, raise the dead, create matter from nothing, and so on. All powers over our world that are easy to imagine. It is no threat to the Christian concept of God that he cannot create square circles, atheistic Christians, people with free will guaranteed to do good, or any other incoherency. As for soul making, I often heard Christians argue that evil is the fire by which souls are refined and prepared for heaven. And the obvious first question from the atheist would be, what good did that refining fire do for the 3-year-old who dies of leukemia? Or the mothers who witnessed their babies' cruel deaths at the hands of the Nazis before then being murdered themselves, or the young deer trapped by a forest fire that dies in burning agony. At first blush, I thought the atheist had a point here. Why permit cruel evils that do no good for anyone, if the whole point of allowing evil is preparation for heavenly countries? For that matter, what did free will have to do with childhood illness or animal suffering? Even if God was going to set these evils right in the end, what was he thinking allowing them in the first place? But then, what was I thinking trying to plumb the depths of the eternal mind? I've been playing chess regularly since elementary school and have learned over the years that masters of the game always make individual moves calculated to attain multiple strategic advantages, some immediate, others long term. Only novice players make single moves for single purposes, and I have increasingly learned to find the moves that will advance multiple aims at once. But the complexity of my thinking could only ever be a droplet in the ocean of complexity within the mind that designed mine. The painting will not be more complex than the painter. I hope my point is clear. The eternal mind from which flows galaxies and neurotransmitters and ecosystems will undoubtedly be a mind capable of making decisions for multiple complex and intertwined reasons. Even my mind can do that. Might God have permitted the existence of evil for multiple reasons? Must the free will and soul making defenses be mutually exclusive? Free will does necessitate the possibility of evil, and suffering does often strengthen the sufferer. So, why place these ideas in conflict or rely on either of them by itself to explain every instance of evil? Might there even be additional reasons that no one has thought of or can grasp? For one seeking to understand, it is horribly unsatisfying to hear, only God can grasp why evil is permitted to exist, so you might as well not even try. Satisfying or not, it is one of the replies the Bible gives to the problem of evil. Probably the best example is the book of Job, which directly addresses the issue. Job is a good man beset by unimaginable loss and suffering, and he appeals to God for an answer to the perennial question, why me? And God's reply? You weren't there when I founded the universe. You can't grasp what I'm capable of. Don't presume to question me. I must admit, I was genuinely angry after reading Job's story. When I finished it, I just sat there in my college dorm room glaring at the Bible in my hands. Really, I was glaring at God. Growing up, some of the words I most despised hearing from my parents were, because I said so. No, explain yourself with logic and evidence, or I will not accept it. Was I now obligated to accept the decisions of a God who looked coldly down on Job's agony and replied, because I said so? Only that wasn't God's final word on the subject. This was the same God who lavishly rewarded Job for his loyalty through the suffering, the God who hates poverty and injustice and commands his followers to fight on behalf of the oppressed, the God who took on human form as Jesus and endured poverty and injustice his entire human life, right up until he was unjustly tortured to death, the Jesus who prayed out loud that the very people who were torturing him be forgiven for their malignant ignorance. He might have been the God who told Job not to question his motives for allowing evil to occur, but he was also the God who consistently opposed evil and even suffered at its hands. But where did that leave me? Well, it left me with what the Christians often call a heavenly father. A father myself, I know what it's like to look down at my toddler and say, no, you can't have candy for breakfast. I know it would make you very happy, but it's not good for you and may even make you sick. You need food that fortifies your body. Plus, too much sugar makes you unmanageable. Child, stop arguing. It's not going to happen. Why? I just told you why. Oh, you demand an answer. Fine. Here's your answer. Because I said so. There is an enormous communication barrier between me and my children, and that barrier exists because there is only so much I can say that they will understand. Their minds simply haven't developed enough to grasp what I would explain to them if I could. Once I have given them reasons that might be within their ability to grasp and they persist in arguing, I am left with nothing except to fall back on my authority and reply, because I said so. Someday you'll understand this. Until then, I will have to settle for making you do what you're told, even if it makes you kick and scream and cry. I love you too much to give you what you're asking for. It should be obvious that the comprehension gap between any given human and the eternal, all knowing mind would dwarf the comprehension gap between any given human parent and child. God could not fully explain himself to his children any more than one could stick the ocean in a coffee mug. So, what else could God do except give a few reasons for the existence of evil that we might grasp, but ultimately take the Heavenly Father approach and insist that we trust Him where our comprehension falls short? The Bible certainly doesn't shy away from addressing the problem of evil. Many instances of evil, including natural disasters, the hostile animal kingdom, and the tragic events of Job's life, are attributed to unseen forces of evil led by Satan. Further, the Bible does describe suffering as a catalyst for developing endurance and self-control, and it even coaches Christians to celebrate suffering and to purposely suffer via fasting and other disciplines. Jesus also once told a parable about wheat and weeds, implying that if evil were to be forcefully removed from among the good before the appropriate time, much desirable good would be lost as a result. That said, the God of Christianity addresses the problem of evil most of all by insisting that his children trust him, specifically his limitless love and his power to make things right in the end. In other words, he wants us to trust that he is truly our Father. He went to great lengths and suffered immensely to get that point across. In the end, I simply wasn't prepared to reject Christianity based on my inability to comprehend God's purposes. How could it be rational to expect God's universe of knowledge to fit inside my small mind? I had to accept that if the God of Christianity were real, then he was the father and I the child. At least he was a father willing to suffer alongside his children. The violent Christian God. The problem of evil did not deeply trouble me, but the problem of God did. I was troubled beyond words to find that the Bible describes a God who can be, to put it mildly, horrifying. Richard Dawkins articulated this point rather vividly, writing that the God of the Bible is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Like the rest of his fellow new atheists, Dawkins' tone drips with venom, but beneath the distracting rhetoric is a real point. The God of the Bible is shockingly harsh at times, often for inexplicable reasons. What was I to make of this behavior from the God who is elsewhere in the same Bible described as the epitome of love? To get to the bottom of this question, I first needed to clarify what God was described as doing, and three categories of activity emerged as significant. One, the brutal military conquests ordered by God. Two, the violence inflicted directly by God. And three, the threat of hell. Concerning brutal conquests, the conquest of Canaan is the most famous, and it was just what it sounds like. God commanded his people to enter the land of Canaan and utterly destroy no fewer than 7 nations, to show them no mercy. And his people did just that. In one city, the Bible says they destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. The modern word for that is genocide, although even genocide doesn't necessarily imply killing the livestock. But the divinely mandated genocide wasn't the behavior that most shocked me. I was even more shocked by God's direct violence, and there was plenty of that too. He burned 2 people alive for offering unauthorized fire to him. In other words, for attempting to worship him in a way he hadn't commanded. He killed another person for instinctually reaching out to stop a holy chest called the Ark of the Covenant from falling to the ground. He killed numerous people for complaining too much. And here's where it gets truly astounding. He killed one couple's baby because the father impregnated a married woman, then murdered her husband to cover it up. But God spared the father, who went on to become one of the most celebrated figures in Judaism and later Christianity. God also killed several children in Egypt, as in every firstborn child in the country, to punish the Egyptian Pharaoh for refusing to release God's people from slavery. Then there was the time 42 children were mocking one of God's prophets for his baldness, and God's response was to send a bear that devoured every one of them. And that's not even mentioning the numerous capital offenses set forth by God, be it homosexuality, premarital sex, being a disobedient child, or working on a Saturday. It gets worse. Consider that the great threat looming over everyone in the Christian worldview is this place called hell, this lake of fire into which those who did not reach the end of their lives in God's book of life are dropped to writhe in eternal torment. In fact, this is apparently the destination of most people. Jesus himself said, "The gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. The gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it." By all appearances, the Christian view is that most of the people you meet in this life will someday be doomed to spend an eternity in an agonizing place where, also in Jesus' words, the worm never dies and the fire is never quenched. Now, contrast this draconian God with what the biblical writers often say about him. For instance, one biblical writer says, "Whoever does not love God does not know God, for God is love." It doesn't say God is loving, it says he is love, the very essence of it. So I'm supposed to believe that this God, who is the very essence of love, is the same God who directly murdered or ordered the murder of innumerable people, many of them innocent? The essence of love would do that? The essence of love would create people only to doom the majority of them to eternal torment? If love was to be unearthed from beneath such severity, I could not find it. When the Christians showed up in God's defense, they really only managed to infuse ambiguity into the situation. They would tell me that the cultures whom God sent his people to utterly destroy were some of the worst imaginable people, heartless, child sacrificing brutes. And anyway, the utterly destroy language was more rhetorical than literal, akin to an American soldier during World War II shouting, "Let's wipe the Germans off the face of the earth." Supposedly, the archaeological findings in the area support this claim and show signs of war only at military bases. I first encountered this point in Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? Further, there were multiple recorded instances of God showing mercy to individual Canaanites when they asked for it or assisted his people. What the Christians seemed to be saying, in short, was that all this talk about genocide was a bit overblown. I could not accept this argument, at least not standing alone. The Christians could try to soften the impact, but the fact remains that God's people invaded at least one city and destroyed every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. The fact also remains that God directly killed all sorts of people, including quite a few children who had nothing to do with the conflicts that ultimately brought about their deaths. At this phase of the conversation, the Christians would often remind me that in a Christian worldview, death is not the worst thing that can happen to a person. They were especially fond of this argument when discussing the children, since the children at their innocent ages would surely have gone on to live in paradise with God after their deaths. Perhaps, argued the Christians, death can sometimes be a form of mercy, especially considering the brutal cultures some of those children would have grown up into. It sounded an awful lot to me like the logic used by every other fictional villain, but I supposed God's all-knowing nature might make it acceptable, if still immensely uncomfortable. This led naturally to their next point, that there would have been practical reasons for wiping out those ancient cultures. God's people were held to standards of kindness, generosity, and social justice far superior to the merciless governing principles of parallel cultures. Copan's book was once again instructive here. If any semblance of those cultures were preserved, God's people might have been corrupted and gone on to normalize such diabolical offenses as child sacrifice. In fact, that's precisely what happened. Worse still, what about all the well-intentioned people God killed for innocuous mishaps? What about the two burned alive for worshiping God with unauthorized fire, or the one killed for instinctively trying to stop the Ark of the Covenant from falling? These questions took me down a path of extraordinary ambiguity. Please understand, the Christians would implore, that God is holy. He cannot coexist with the faintest trace of evil, cannot tolerate even the tiniest disobedience. This was one of my early run-ins with words I consider churchy, specifically the word holy, and it meant nothing to me. From what I could tell, they were saying that God's perfect goodness sometimes, but certainly not always, led him to destroy those who contradicted his wishes, since his wishes were the very definition of goodness. As for why he chose to kill those who accidentally worshipped him the wrong way, rather than, say, Hitler, I could not be sure. Most troubling of all was this place they called hell. How could a loving God create humanity, knowing the majority of them would spend eternity in a fiery torture chamber? Here the ambiguity reached its pinnacle. When I investigated hell, I found an array of wildly diverse opinions. Some Christians insisted hell is only ever temporary, that all people will eventually be cured of all evil and adopted into God's paradise. I found this viewpoint best expressed in George MacDonald's masterpiece, Unspoken Sermons. Other Christians argued that hell is merely symbolic of the total annihilation of the wicked. They will be erased, body and soul, from existence. And for centuries, the mainstream Christian view of hell was that, although it is eternal, no one goes there before first spending time after death in an in-between place called purgatory, where they have a fair opportunity to choose God's way or insist on their own way. C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce is a striking fictional depiction of purgatory, and of course there is Dante's The Divine Comedy, famously depicting both hell and purgatory. Unsure what to think, I consulted the book Four Views on Hell, which pitted four Christian theologians against each other in a series of essay debates on the subject. By the end of the book, my uncertainty had only deepened. Every view could be presented with biblical support, yet only one could be true. The Christians claimed theirs was not a God of confusion, but I was finding him perfectly confusing. Unlimited ambiguity lurked behind every corner. Did God order genocide? Sort of, but not as thorough a genocide as it first appears, plus, he did it to prevent worse evils. Did God kill several people himself, many of them innocent? Yes, but remember that he is holy and death isn't the worst thing that can happen to a person. Will God sentence the majority of people to eternal torment? Unclear. If I couldn't even be sure of what God was doing, how could I come anywhere near understanding why he was doing it? I once again found myself wholly incapable of answering a question I had gotten rather used to asking, the same question Job asked from the depths of despair. God, why? What were you thinking? Thus, I had come full circle, once again demanding that God explain the reasons underlying his conduct. As for me, I could find no way to reconcile the love of God with his incredible harshness. The Apostle Paul wrote, "Note then the kindness and the severity of God," and that was really all the Christians could say about it once backed into a corner. Yes, he's harsh, they would say, but more than that, he's loving. Indeed, if love is the word that sums up God's personality, then it would follow that even his harshest acts would be acts of love. I wanted so badly to reconcile the love and harshness of God, but that would have been possible only if I knew and understood what he was doing and why he was doing it, only if I could see the good that would come of his conduct. I had come face to face with that familiar black box, totally inaccessible to my feeble intellect, the mind of God. Here was perhaps the most crucial crossroad in my intellectual journey so far. I had to decide whether I could believe in this God, the God of love who kills babies to punish their parents, the God of Jesus and of hell, the God whose severity was as staggering as his generosity. I considered many of God's commands and grew nauseous. I considered what hell might be like and shuddered. I considered that if I became a Christian, I would have to try explaining to non Christians how my perfectly loving God was the God who did all that, and the very thought of it made me flush with embarrassment. These scruples were largely emotional, I had to admit. Intellectually, I was in the same position as before. I had to decide, now with higher emotional stakes, if it would make sense to reject the Christian God because I could not understand him. Was my bar for belief set so high that the only way I could accept Christianity would be if I could comprehend the eternal mind at its center? Do scientists reasonably deny the existence of the natural world because it is currently impossible to reconcile general relativity with quantum mechanics? Do children reasonably deny the existence of their parents because they cannot understand how the dad who plays with them is the same dad who puts them in timeout? Do not mistake such examples for flippancy. God's severity is nothing to be flippant about. The difference between the analogies, however, is a difference in degree, not in kind. The logical point runs through it all. It is irrational to deny belief in a complex entity based on an inability to understand how its known elements coexist. If this can be said of parents and of the natural world, it will surely ring true for the God who designed it all. This was how mature Christians understood the leap of faith necessary to become a Christian. It was not a leap into total irrationality, not a categorical refusal or inability to defend one's beliefs. Rather, it was a leap into trusting God through uncertainty, including uncertainty about his purposes. Rational thinking could get me only as far as my ability to comprehend the available evidence. Thus, I could rationally conclude that the God of Christianity existed, but could not rationally expect to comprehend him. In fact, given what Christianity says about the moral corruption of humanity, I could not even rationally expect to be appalled by the same evils or drawn to the same goods as God, thus calling into question my credibility to even critique the morality of his conduct. If my reason led me to believe in God, the same reason would lead me to perceive my own intellectual and moral inadequacy before him. The rational next step after belief would be to humble myself before the Heavenly Father, no matter how incomprehensible he might be. I would have to accept the role of a child. Other arguments. Finally, there came the arguments that, however common, never made me seriously question the Christian claims. For one, there was the popular postmodern post-truth argument that there are far too many religions and belief systems to justify concluding that one of them is true. The probability is too low of selecting the correct belief system. Anyway, the truth is like an elephant, and we are like so many blind people approaching the elephant with only our sense of touch to tell us what it is. The person touching the trunk will assert that it is long and snake-like, whereas the person touching the ears will assert that it is something like a dehydrated stingray. All will be correct, but none absolutely correct. One's knowledge can only ever be a piece of the bigger picture. I didn't totally disagree. After all, I had just decided that my slice of truth about the infinitely complex Christian God was woefully slim. Of course, no one knows everything, and of course, we have much to learn from others. What struck me as bizarre was how readily these postmodernists took these humble points and went on to make grand absolute statements. Most notable was the very assertion in question that Christianity must be false because it claims to be true. It is quite a leap from the common sense assertion that no one knows everything to the grand assertion that anyone who claims to know anything is wrong. It was a leap I would not take, most notably because it is self-defeating. The assertion that all truth claims are false is itself a truth claim, thus rendering the assertion as meaningless as the square-shaped circles discussed earlier. You don't take hold of an elephant's ear, then conclude that the elephant is imaginary because you aren't sure what the rest of it is like. As for the related point that it is statistically improbable to find the correct worldview among countless options, I did find this convincing as a call to humble open mindedness, but not as a call to reject the reasonable conclusions drawn from what I had observed up to that point. If I examined the evidence for Christianity and found it strong enough to merit belief, could I then rewind to the beginning of the journey and deny Christianity because it had been unlikely at first that Christianity would emerge from the pack as the worldview best supported by the evidence? Could I argue that my opponent didn't roll a pair of ones with the dice because there was only a 3% chance that she would roll it before she actually did so? Of course not. The odds of some occurrence before it happens become irrelevant once it has actually happened. Then there was the philosophical point famously argued by David Hume that it is categorically unreasonable to believe any miracle has occurred. He based this conclusion on essentially two premises. One, miracles are rare and improbable, thus requiring significant evidence, and two, witness testimony in favor of miracles is categorically unreliable. Since miracles can only ever be evidenced by this unreliable witness testimony, it is always unreasonable to believe a miracle has occurred. Hume's argument fails to account for significant complexity. Even school children know that not all witness accounts are equally credible. If the least honest and most attention-hungry person I know starts telling everyone that he saw Alexander the Great walking around in his garden this morning, I won't give it much thought. He's probably just lying for attention again. If three of my trusted friends approach me and earnestly insist that they saw Alexander the Great walking around in the garden this morning, I might have some questions. Are they pranking me? Was the sun out? Were they close enough to get a clear look? How do they even know what Alexander the Great looks like? But if dozens of people start claiming they saw the same person risen from the dead and are willing to die gruesome deaths for the claim, I will take them more seriously. I hope my point is coming through. Numerous factors affect the credibility of witness testimony, but Hume seemed uninterested in evaluating those factors beyond sweeping generalities. For my part, I could not take seriously any argument that categorically forbade me from examining the evidence. Another common argument I heard was that Christians have been responsible for terrible conduct throughout history. Witness the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, and modern evangelical opposition to civil rights causes. This argument falls short on the common sense basis that it is irrational to judge a belief system by its worst adherents. The Nazis made serious advances in modern medicine using gruesome, torturous methods. Must I reject modern medicine by association? In general, I was unable to find any logical connection between the truth of a thought system and the behavior of its individual adherents. I found correlations between certain belief systems and certain conduct, such as the correlation between Christianity and charitable giving, but that was as far as it went. It is far too easy to claim a belief system without really understanding what the system entails. Quacks using unreliable methods may call themselves physicians, but they don't adhere to the accepted practices of modern medicine, which is why it would be unreasonable to use their bad methodology as evidence that modern medicine doesn't work. Scientific atheists once formed a spectacularly cruel and murderous political regime under Lenin, and it was nothing for atheists or scientists to be proud of. To reject Christianity, I would need evidence that it was false, not merely evidence that it had attracted bad eggs. Finally, there was the argument that science has disproven numerous biblical claims, thus rendering the entire Bible suspect. Though atheists did indeed vaguely allude to numerous claims, there was really only one conflict in this category that atheists ever brought up to me, and it was that the Bible describes the creation of Earth as a 6-day event that would have taken place around 10,000 years ago, complete with diversity of species. Whereas it is widely accepted in the scientific community that Earth is about 4.5 billion years old and that the diversity of species on our planet came about through natural selection. Thus, declared the atheists, Christianity and science stand in direct conflict with each other, and one cannot be true without denying the other. I quickly realized that the conflict here was not between Christianity and science. I already knew those two could coexist even within the same mind. Francis Collins, for instance, directed the Human Genome Project, which did quite a lot for the theory of evolution, and his scientific expertise actually drove him toward Christianity rather than away from it. Not an uncommon causal chain. The conflict, therefore, was between science and a specific subset of Christians, often called young earth creationists, who appeared to insist on taking the entire Bible literally. Or, framed differently, the conflict was between Christianity and a specific subset of anti-Christian scientists who appeared to insist on taking the entire Bible literally. However you slice it, the problem was the same: insistence on taking the entire Bible literally. At this phase, atheists will often scoff about how Christians are just stacking the deck in their favor if every time science disproves its claims, Christians simply cry, "It was figurative," and leave it at that. But underlying their scorn, I saw a valid question. Why decide some things in the Bible were literal and others figurative? Where do we draw the line? Once again, I found oversimplifications to be the enemy of truth, and one gross oversimplification would be to treat the Bible as a single book. The Bible is more like a library, complete with books of prophecy, history, epic poetry, songs, letters, and mythology. Even the content within individual books could be taken differently depending on the context. For instance, the books describing the history of Jesus' life are full of parables, stories much like Aesop's fables designed to convey ideals. Jesus' listeners never thought the parables were literal accounts of actual events, since that clearly wasn't the purpose of those stories. Understanding the literary genre and context of any given book or section of the Bible would help me discern what to expect from it. And when I investigated the early chapters of Genesis, most notably in John N. Oswalt's The Bible Among the Myths and David J. Atkinson's The Message of Genesis 1 through 11, I found those chapters remarkably similar to other ancient mythologies, but with several important differences. Unlike parallel mythologies that were polytheistic and had a low view of humanity, Genesis described the creation of our world as a willful act of one God. It claimed humans were created in this one God's image, but had sinned and brought a great deal of evil upon themselves, and it described evil creatures at work in the world that purposely contributed to humanity's fall, all themes central to the Christian worldview. A myth could thus be defined as a symbolic rather than historical or scientific depiction of the truth, and it would be intellectually lazy to see something categorized as a myth, then immediately decry it as false and flee the scene. A myth, like a fable or metaphor, is designed to convey the truth by different means than a straightforward factual account, something virtually everyone accepts in other contexts. If you call someone a snake, for example, your listeners won't assume the person sprang from the bushes and tried to bite your ankles. They will perceive the meaning beneath the metaphor. Consider, too, that if God really did dictate the early chapters of Genesis, as Christians claim, it's worth asking what use the primordial humans would have had for a scientifically inerrant cosmology textbook. If God was real and took a real interest in helping them, then the best medicine for their brutal existence would have been a relationship with God Himself, the source of all truth and reality. One who faults God for giving primordial humans a palatable means of coming to Him might as well fault a medical doctor for giving a child a chewy vitamin and saying, "It's candy that makes you grow big and strong," rather than enumerating the Latin monstrosities on the ingredient list and explaining how those chemicals interact with the child's stomach acids. What would be the point? True or not, the child won't get anything out of it. The goal of the communication dictates how it is conveyed, and the party with superior knowledge must often convey only what his hearer is capable of accepting. With that framework in mind, What would happen if I took the early chapters of Genesis to be the foundational Christian mythology, designed to convey the basics of what would eventually become the Christian worldview? Viewed this way, the discrepancies between Genesis and science would be no more troubling than with Jesus' parables. In fact, Genesis would be scientifically impressive, predicting long before the scientists caught up that our universe had a distinct beginning, a moment of creation. Some Christians take this old earth view while still believing that at a definitive point in history, God put his spirit into two specific people, Adam and Eve, who were every bit as real as the moment our universe sprang into existence. Rather than advocate for any particular view, I will simply point out that once this literary analysis has come in, possibilities for nuance abound, and reasonable Christians often reach differing conclusions on these topics. The important point is that this literary analysis of the Bible does no violence to the broader Christian worldview. It doesn't follow, for instance, that if the early chapters of Genesis are treated as symbolic now, then the historical accounts of Jesus' life will eventually be backed into a corner by science and forced into the same category. As surely as the literary critics can identify the Genesis creation account as mythology, the Psalms as poetry, the book of Ephesians as a letter, and Jesus' parables as fables, they can identify the witness accounts of Jesus' life as history. Plus, it's not as though the average first century person thought rising from the dead was possible when Jesus did it. The scientific impossibility of Jesus' resurrection was precisely why the event was so significant and secured so many followers. There has never been room in Christianity for a figurative resurrection. In the words of one biblical writer, if Jesus did not really rise from the dead, Christians should be pitied more than anyone. On the other hand, there is plenty of room in Christianity for nuance, literary or otherwise. Christianity's opponents had some strong points, but none strong enough to outweigh the arguments in its favor. It seemed the Christians, the thoughtful ones at least, had valid replies to any attack their opponents cared to launch. The problem of evil and God's seemingly monstrous conduct, troubling as they were, both ran up against the same obstacle: the irrationality of making my belief contingent on grasping the mind of God. The remaining attacks barely got off the ground. In short, when I looked at the evidence in favor of Christianity and weighed it against the alternatives, I had more than enough evidence to believe the claims of Christianity. So why did I still not believe? Prayer. God, I just can't understand you. If the Christians are right, you have done such shocking things. You've created a world brimming with evil and suffering. You've made your followers kill countless people, even women and children. You've killed plenty of others yourself, often for reasons I cannot begin to comprehend. I want to trust you, but how can I when you're so harsh and unpredictable? If what the Bible says about you is true, I cannot help but tremble in your presence. Yet there's also Jesus. He taught extraordinary lessons, performed extraordinary miracles, and endured extraordinary pain. The Christians say he did it all out of love. They say that everything you do comes from love. I don't understand it, God, your kindness and severity, but I want to. I want to know your love. I want to trust you. If you're real, I know you will be beyond my comprehension. If you're real, you will be the father and I the child. As hard as it is for me to accept this, I will if I have to. I'm very near to believing in you, God. Will you help me with my doubts?